the IPCC report is essentially broken down into two subsections. The first subsection that you've just heard from Martin and Claire looks at the trends in extreme weather and climate events. It looks at the trends in vulnerability, and it looks in the trends in exposure. And so it sets up a kind of, what have we seen so far and what are we likely to see in the future in terms of disaster risk. The second part of the report really assesses existing practice and the adequacy of existing practice in meeting the kind of trends that we're seeing now and the trends in the future. And then the second part of that says, well, recognizing that existing practice is likely not to be enough to deal with the future, what are some of the options that we've got? And so I'm just going to take you through a few kind of highlights from this kind of practice section, which within the report is split across scales. So we look at practice at local level, we looked at practice at national level and within national systems for managing risk, and then also within the international system and at regional level. So 3 chapters broken down by scale. And so, as I said, the core questions we're trying to ask is what's the past experience of tackling climate extremes from the perspective of disaster risk management and adaptation to climate change? What has been the effectiveness of the approaches, and how does that experience vary and differ between countries, sectors and disciplines? So really the context to this, and very much sets up the report, as Martin mentioned, there's a long experience of tackling climate extremes. This is not new per se, and the experience spans risk reduction, risk transfer, preparedness, response, recovery, and reconstruction. The whole kind of disaster cycle, as those from the disasters community have come to know it. And certainly in the last decade, there are increasing linkages between disaster risk management and climate change adaptation communities, which really kind of led to this report being proposed. And I think what we've also found is that kind of managing disaster risk and the kind of the immediacy of disaster risk can be a very tangible entry point for governments to the challenge of adapting to climate change. And certainly we see through experience that a number of governments who've got existing disaster risk management systems and practices have used that as a way to kind of mainstream the idea of climate change into government. And so in this part of the report, what we were very clear that we wanted to do was to assess the scientific literature and the technical literature, but to be very broad in the way that we sourced evidence. So recognizing that some of the most interesting and high quality assessments come from the UN system, from governments and from civil society, but recognizing that it's the author team's responsibility to really investigate the quality of those pieces of evidence and make some quite difficult judgments in some cases about what gets in and what doesn't get in. Okay, and please disregard what it says section C. Section C is the kind of the part of the summary for policymakers. So what we wanted to do really in assessing this experience was look at some of the drivers of change in disaster risk and the drivers of change particularly in vulnerability and exposure, and then to consider what options we had in terms of policy and practice and experience in tackling some of those drivers and in trying to reverse some of the trends that we were seeing. And so, what we tried to do throughout those chapters and across those scales is to think about humanitarian relief and recovery and the way that that fits within the system, risk sharing and transfer, and the synergies between climate risk management, disaster risk management and adaptation to climate change, and also consider the role of data and what it meant to kind of mainstream into development. I think what we managed to do was to provide, I think, quite a good kind of conceptual framework for that, which essentially says a good disaster risk management system and good climate change adaptation involves pursuing a suite of policy options and practice. It's not about choosing one or the other. And so in that regard, in providing an assessment to governments, we said, look, what you've got to do is very carefully consider what types of risks you're facing now, what are the level of those risks, how are they going to change, which involves looking at changes in extremes, changes in exposure and changes at vulnerability at different scales, and then basing a kind of policy response on that information. And the policy response being options to reduce risk through reducing vulnerability and exposure, which often is just really good development with an eye on disaster risk. Also, where you can't do that and you've got residual risks left over, to share and transfer that risk, potentially through insurance and reinsurance, but also possibly through distributing that risk within local systems over space and time, community savings pools, things like that. And then the other part of this system is recognizing that there are simply some risks you can't do anything about. What you've got to do is just prepare for disaster happening, and to prepare well, to make sure the early warning systems are good, people are ready, and to know how to respond effectively, and use that response as an opportunity to build resilience and put in a more robust system next time round. And so to think of it then as a continuum, what slight difference there is to that picture, which is quite familiar to many of those disaster risk management communities, this dimension of uncertainty and surprises. You know, we've got extreme events changing in frequency, severity, duration, spatial extent. So we're finding that some places are seeing things that they've not seen before. And this provides, this requires a slightly different dimension to that system, which is really about building adaptive capacity and the kind of components of a resilient system in a way that may not be such a kind of a lived experience for many of those working in this area. So, you know, promoting learning across the system, integration of governance scales, better kind of self-organisation at the local level, and all these elements that we need to build in. One of the conclusions was, you know, simply that there's a lot of governments simply aren't doing this. Existing systems in most countries, in many countries, are inadequate, and very few countries are really getting to grips with the trends in exposure, vulnerability, and climate extremes that would allow them to make these kind of informed judgments. What we do is we try and highlight where there's good practice, but we're very keen to say that that practice is sporadic. It's patchy, and you know, there needs to be a real kind of critical reflection on the adequacy that we see. Which leads me on to Professor Pelling, who's going to talk about, well, you know, what does the future look like, recognizing that existing practice in some cases may not be enough. Mark.